Well, apparently it's not unusual to get snow in April, but I don't think I've ever seen snow on April 14th. But we got a pretty good amount of it last night. That's okay. Should be gone by the end of the day. Okay guys, let's get back to work. So I've made a few trips to the Toyota dealership, and we have fully armed the parts cannon. So I have 4 new pistons. I have 4 new spark plugs. I have 1 new head bolt. I have 1 new oil filter and 1 new oil fill cap. The car has an aftermarket one on. There may have been an incident involving my wife and a hammer. We won't talk about that. I bought the For Real Toyota FIPG Foreman Place Gasket RTV silicone. I bought 2 gallons of extended life Toyota coolant, and I bought the kit, which is the kit that Toyota uses when they do the actual warranty. And inside it has all the goodies that we need. So there's a front and rear main seal, there's a couple of axle nuts that we won't use. These are our piston ring sets, valve cover gasket, intake gasket, some O-rings, a head gasket, and an exhaust gasket, a new donut for the catalytic converter manifold thingamajigger, and new piston cooling nozzles. So everything with the engine is cleaned up and ready to go. All the gasket surfaces are prepped, and you don't need to watch me do that. All I can say is just be careful, because everything is aluminum and it's pretty easy to damage or gouge or whatever. Really what I found works best for these engines is just scrape off all the crud with a good quality scraper, and then I like to use a stone. So something like this, just a good fine stone and some light oil like WD-40, and it'll clean those gasket surfaces right up. Even the head and everything you can do that way. There's really no need to use power tools for any of this stuff. The piston is marked here with a little dot. That's the front. And then the connecting rod also has a little bump out. That's the front. So the difference between the A, B, and C piston is actually with the wrist pin. So the wrist pin diameters are slightly different. That's why the rods and pistons are marked, and you don't want to mix up the wrist pin. You need to make sure you put it back into the same rod that it came out of. So pretty standard setup on the rings. The oil ring expander goes in first, and you just want to make sure that the ends aren't overlapped, and put the parting line about here. Then the lower oil ring Okay, there's the oil ring. So it's got the TSB includes a whole map that tells you how they want the rings to be laid out, but pretty standard. They just want the gaps to be staggered. So we put our second fire ring in here. It's got a little etched label that needs to face up. And we'll put the gap down here in this corner. And then the top fire ring. We'll put its gap up here in this corner. So that's it. And I've got these fancy pliers for expanding rings, but it's not necessary with these pistons. So make sure your piston's pointed forward. And that's it. So you can put some plastic gauge on these bearings if you want to check the clearance, but I'm not even going to bother. They look perfect to me. That you can still see the machining marks in the babbitt layer, so no reason. There's nothing wrong with the bottom end of this engine, that's for sure. Alright, I installed the new piston cooling nozzles, and they get torqued to 62 inch-pounds, which is basically nothing. So the connecting rods get torqued to 18 foot-pounds, 24.5 Newton meters. And you're supposed to kind of sneak up on it. So now we have to go another 90 degrees, and I did put oil on the threads before I installed the bolts. Someday I'll buy one of those fancy tech angle torque wrenches, but this thing works okay. Okay, I'm ready to put the lower part of the crankcase together. I did put a new O-ring here. And then the crankshaft has to be set so cylinder number 1 is at top dead center because the balance shafts have to be timed. And I've got the RTV applied. And I've got the balance shafts aligned according to the manual. So 18 foot-pounds on these bolts as well. Well, I think we're ready for the head, so go ahead and put it together. Well, it says that it should be a lot number that faces up. Looks like it. Okay, cylinder head bolt torque. You're supposed to do it in multiple steps and then torque it to 52 foot-pounds and then another 90 degrees. So I think what we'll do is we'll go to like 25 foot-pounds, then we'll go to 52, then we'll go to 90, and then hopefully we'll be okay. And there's a for real sequence, but like always, just start in the middle, work your way out. So again, it's a triple square socket, or some people call it a bi-hex. Whatever floats your boat. And guys were asking in my first video about the head bolts. No, they can be reused. Book just says to check the threads for deformation, or I guess for stretching. Oh man. Well, those babies are tight. So 22 foot-pounds and 80 inch-pounds for the smaller ones. Okay, we're going to go ahead and set the timing. It's pretty easy to do. So the timing chain has these links that are darker, and each darker link corresponds to one of the timing marks. And also on the bearing cap right here, there's a little arrow. There's a corresponding arrow over here on the exhaust side. So we want to line up, this is the timing mark, and this is the timing mark. Now there's a lot of other marks on this one sprocket. Don't worry about that. This is the one that matters. And kind of use your brain. It makes sense. We're on top dead center cylinder number 1 right now. And look at the cams. See how the valves are both closed, and it's getting ready to open the exhaust cam. So we're top dead center compression right now. Alright, so it's a little hard probably to see it on the camera, but we got our darker link on the timing mark here, and our darker link on the timing mark here. So again, on the crankshaft sprocket, there's a timing mark right here, and it also lines up with one of the dark links. And we'll go ahead and install our tensioner guide here. So there's another kind of guide, a metal guide that runs underneath of that small sprocket on the crankshaft. Torque that to spec. And our timing is set. So it's front cover time. They want you to put extra RTV at the parting line for the head, and then I put some extra down here at the parting line for the crankcase, and then don't forget to do it around the bolt holes. Install your crank sensor trigger wheel and the new front main seal, and then I think we're ready to put this on. Alright, the chain tensioner is a little weird. He uses this little hook, so you gotta collapse it and then latch the hook, and then it should go in. Let's see. It'll only go in one way. It comes with a new gasket. Yeah, 133 foot-pounds. Now we should be able to rotate the crankshaft counterclockwise and hear the tensioner click. There it was, right there. .80 inch-pounds on these screws. Okay, I got the flex plate installed. Bolts are torqued, 61 foot-pounds. And then if you guys remember, I had that one bell housing bolt that was stripped out. So what I decided to do, instead of heel coiling it, I just drilled it out to a clearance size and then bought a longer bolt. And then I'm going to just put a nut on the back side of it. So So anyway, I had to clearance the side of the crankcase a little bit, but I don't think that'll hurt anything. So might be a little bit janky, but it's what I'm gonna do. Yeah. That's the hardest bolt on this whole project as far as I'm concerned, at the bottom of the intake manifold. Okay guys, we're getting very, very close. I turned this shop upside down last night trying to find this stinking bolt for the alternator. And yeah, I cleaned everything, swept the floors, organized the hardware, and yeah, couldn't find it. I actually stopped at the hardware store by my house and bought a new one last night because I was convinced it was gone. Anyway, this morning, within 30 seconds, I found it. So that's a good deal. You know, it's not a problem to buy a new bolt, but it starts to kind of gnaw at you. You know, where did it go? You start having all kinds of visions of it dropping down into the intake manifold, and yeah, it's not good. We need to find all the bolts. The other stumbling block I have is with this other idler here. I was going to replace the bearings in it, but they're non-standard bearings. They have a smaller inner diameter. So I ordered an aftermarket replacement for it because I didn't want to fool around with making a spacer, which I could easily just make a bushing to go inside the bearing, but we got to get this thing done. Okay, while we're waiting for the idler pulley to come in, we'll go ahead and fix this heat shield. So you see it just rotted this whole mount completely away, but the bolt and everything was still attached to the converter, so I just cleaned it up, and I think what I'm going to do is use this washer to kind of weld it into the heat shield like that. It'll get us by until I can find a used one. The price on a new one is kind of crazy. Well, it's definitely not pretty, but it's only temporary unless it works. Yeah, she's got some oil to cook off that new catalytic converter. And definitely much quieter. I'm still getting a little smoke rolling off of that new catalytic converter, but otherwise looks good. No leaks, runs good, drives good. I say we ship it. So I thought we could take a look at these old pistons. So here's the old style oil ring, and it's a two-piece ring. So it has this expander and then the actual oil ring here. And you see how loaded up with carbon this one is, so yeah, pretty nasty. And then obviously the new pistons used a three-piece design, as you saw when I installed it. And then as far as the piston goes, I didn't see a huge difference between the new and the old pistons, at least visually. The only thing I could really tell you is it has the same number of drain holes, they're in roughly the same location, and they're roughly the same diameter. However, these drain holes seem to go, basically they're drilled radial in this way, you know, kind of perpendicular to the center axis of the piston. But on the new pistons, the hole seems to be kind of angled downward a little bit. So if you look at these oil drain holes, I've basically drilled these holes out, and that's what they should look like. That's the diameter that they should be. Take a look at the other side. So not too bad there, not too bad there. Then look at that one. Completely plugged. And this one here is really bad. So that one's open, plugged, plugged, plugged. So anyway, I don't think it's hard to say that we made the right call, that the pistons and rings were causing the oil consumption issue. You can see how much carbon's built up on these pistons. And I've already scraped a lot of it off to try to get to the identifier number for the pistons. So the other question is, could we have reused these pistons? Just clean out the drain holes and replace the rings. And I don't know the answer to that question. Now the parts man told me that basically once the warranty pistons were in production, that they stopped selling the old style pistons. But I didn't even check to see if the new rings were compatible, backward compatible with the old pistons. So I don't know the answer to that question. Now probably you could go aftermarket for rings and then reuse your pistons that way. And it's probably a pretty low risk because the car went 150,000 miles without burning oil. So if you cleaned out the holes and replaced the rings, there's a chance that you could get another 150,000 miles out of it. And I don't think this car is going over 300,000 miles. So, it's up to you. But there is $240 worth of pistons there, so something to think about. Okay guys, I think that's it. We got Mama back on the road. And about 5 seconds after I told her it was running, she peeled out of here and we haven't heard from her since. So, no news is good news in this line of work. Let's hope it stays that way. And obviously it was a big job, but totally doable. And I think we did a pretty good job of it. I don't see any oil leaks or coolant leaks. The car doesn't make any unusual noises. No check engine light on. It warms up to temperature. Drives fine, has plenty of power. So I don't think there's anything to worry about. The rings are obviously going to need some time to seat, and we're going to have to keep an eye on the oil consumption. I don't know at this point whether or not we fixed the problem, but just based on the condition of the old pistons, I think it's pretty safe to say that we made the right call. So I guess we'll do a little bit of a chit-chat here at the end. I'll try to answer some questions that I had from the first video, which has been published at this time. Now, as far as the catalytic converter goes, I don't know if it can be salvaged or repaired some way. I don't know that much about it. I do know that it was not working when I made the first video. You can see from the graph that I posted, that's from the Autel scan tool, and the top line is just a steady line. That's the voltage from the air-fuel ratio sensor, or some people call it a wideband O2 sensor, and that's what these Toyotas use. It's a little bit different from what we're used to seeing with domestic cars, where they have two O2 sensors, and you see your upstream O2 sensor switching back and forth from lean to rich, and then after the catalytic converter, the downstream O2 sensor should be nice and smooth after the car is warmed up, because the catalytic converter is basically evening out the lean-rich condition in the exhaust stream. So what we should have seen in that video is that the first graph should have been smooth like it was, because the air-fuel ratio sensor should have a constant voltage, anytime that the car is basically at steady state. And the downstream O2 sensor should have also been steady, because the vehicle was warmed up. The O2 sensor should have been the cat should have been smoothing out those ripples, but you could see it was switching all over. And actually what happens with this one, because on the Toyota the downstream O2 sensor is quite a ways back from the catalytic converter. It's probably at least this far away. It's in a separate pipe. It would actually, because the catalytic converter wasn't working, the exhaust gases would get so cool that the downstream O2 sensor would stop functioning at all. It needs heat in order to work. So I didn't take any follow-up with the scan tool, but basically now that we've replaced the catalytic converter, we have nice steady voltage on both of the sensors, which is what we should have. And I confirmed that with another Toyota Rav4 that I had access to, basically a known good, and what we have now is exactly the same as our known good. Okay, another question that I had was, could you do this job without removing the engine from the car? And the answer is yes, but I don't know how much it would actually save you, because in order to do this job with the engine in the car, it's totally possible from a technical standpoint, but you still have to remove the oil pan, the lower crankcase, the timing cover, the converter manifold, the intake manifold, the head, all that stuff, timing chain, all that stuff still has to come off. And by the time you do all of that work, you're really only your 4 bell housing bolts 6 torque converter bolts and 3 bolts through the support bearing for the axle shaft away from just removing the engine. So I don't know that it really saves you any time. Now, if you didn't have an engine stand or an engine crane or any way to deal with the engine once it was out of the vehicle, maybe that's a good option for you. But as far as I'm concerned, you're so much less efficient working up over your head trying to take the rod bearings apart and do all that jazz. You might as well just pull the engine, put it on a stand where you can really work on it, and it's just not that big of a deal. And a lot of people were asking about the head bolts. All the bolts inside the engine are reusable as long as there's no distortion in the threads. So basically, if the bolts thread in easily, then you're free to go ahead and reuse them. If the bolts don't want to thread in, then you probably need to replace them. Like on the rod bolts, there's a minimum spec for basically the neck diameter, and I did check that. On mine it was fine, so no reason to replace the fasteners. And I guess that leads to the next topic, which is how much time should it take to do this job. I looked up the book time to replace the rings is like 21 hours, and I would say you can easily beat that time even if you don't have experience with these engines. It's really pretty easy to work on. Now, I would be very curious to know, like, if there's any factory Toyota guys that are watching this, what Toyota pays their technicians for the warranty. Because I'm sure it's less than that. It's probably closer to, I don't know, 14 or 16 hours. I'm just guessing. And I would say that an experienced guy who works on these engines a lot, I bet he could do this job in less than 12 hours. It's really not that bad, especially if he has access to all the special tools and parts that he needs. I'd also like to know what Toyota dealership would charge to do this job outside of the warranty. I'm guessing, I don't know, of course it varies throughout the country, but I would guess around this area you're probably looking at $3,500 to $4,000. So one other kind of oddity, as far as I can tell, I was the first kind of independent shop to ever buy these parts outside of the Toyota dealership to do this job. So I don't know if that's true for any other dealerships. The one that we have here in this area is a fairly large dealership. They sell to a lot of shops. I'm kind of surprised that I would be the first person to ever run into this issue. So I don't know what other people are doing. They're going aftermarket or what, but yeah, I'm the first person to ever buy them, to the point that they didn't even really know how to sell them to me. Like when I initially called, I was sure there was some kind of like a parts kit you can buy for the extended warranty program, and he confirmed that there was, but he didn't even know if they could sell it to me since it wasn't basically billed to a warranty job. Really, the parts were not that expensive. So all in with the converter and a bunch of other miscellaneous stuff, I'm still under $1,000, and I consider that pretty reasonable. So as far as the engine goes, I was pretty impressed with that. I never really had a Toyota engine apart before, so I didn't know what to expect when we looked inside, but I was pretty pleased, and it seems very well thought out. I don't know if you guys noticed, but on the bottom end, it's a 4-cylinder engine, but it has 5 main bearings. So it has 1 main bearing between each cylinder, and the crankshaft looks nice and beefy. And yeah, I think there was a forced induction version of this engine, so I guess that would make sense. But yeah, definitely overbuilt down there on the bottom end. And then it has the balance shafts, which is a nice feature because these 4-cylinder engines can rattle like crazy. If you've ever worked around a 4BT Cummins, you know what I'm talking about. So the balance shafts really make the engine nice and smooth. The other thing that's kind of cool, because it's a variable valve timing, it doesn't have any kind of an EGR system, so you don't have to worry about all that crap. I don't know how they do it. They must use the BVTI to do some kind of extended valve overlap, but yeah, that simplifies things a lot. The only thing I don't really like is I'm not a huge fan of the way they do the timing chain tensioner, but it works. It's just I think it's a little bit unusual. Okay, so a couple of notes about assembling the engine, and everybody's already tuned out, so it's just you and me right now. A few things to note. You got to make sure you remove the timing chain tensioner before you remove the front cover, because on this engine the timing chain tensioner is built into the front cover, and if you do not remove it first, there's a chance you could actually break the guide. So make sure you do that. You need to make sure you remove the VVTI solenoid before you take off the cylinder head or try to remove the cylinder head bolts. The VVTI solenoid actually kind of almost pokes out over top of one of the cylinder head bolts, so be careful with that. Also, it is 100% possible to put the cylinder head gasket on backwards, so be conscious of that. You have to make sure you put the little tag with the lot number facing up, and then if you look at the cutout of the gasket, it's pretty obvious which way it goes. But the dowel pins are symmetrical, so you can put it on backwards. And I don't know what we're going to do next as far as videos go. I know we've had a kind of a slug of automotive type stuff, just because that's what's been on my plate. But I do have some new toys that we can play with next time in the video. Something like this, and this, and this, fresh off the boat. So maybe we'll play with those. Thanks for watching, guys.